For years, the world has seen reality distorted, facts manipulated, and truth hidden. But there's even more to the story than anyone has ever suspected. Because no one has been able to see the whole picture. Until now.
Mulder?
We are back.
Yay, we're back.
I am host, filmmaker Jared Bratt. With me, as always, filmmaker, interviewer, reviewer, Carl Diamond.
Hey, Jared, it's good to do this again. It's been a couple months, I think.
Yeah, it's been a minute. Joining Carl and myself, fellow filmmaker, interviewer, reviewer, Robert Mitchell.
Hey guys, it's great to be back with you all.
We're keeping the paranoia going on this episode, coming off of A Scanner Darkly. This episode, we are talking about the X-Files feature film released in 1998, directed by Rob Bowman. This movie's screenplay is written by Frank Spotnitz, who was one of the series writers and developers, and the story was by Chris Carter, who was essentially the series creator. I've been pushing for us to talk about this movie for a while. I just think it covers a lot of bases in terms of UFOs and aliens. Seems like every other day that stuff is in the news, so I thought it'd be a really good time to talk about one of my favorite movies. I'm coming at this as a fan of the X-Files series. I think I've been able to divorce myself from that and just look at this as a very tightly made conspiracy action sci-fi thriller. So I kind of appreciate the movie from those two viewpoints.
I'm a fan of the show, but I didn't watch all of the show. I think I've watched the first 2 seasons. It's an interesting relationship between me and the X-Files. I could barely get enough courage to get through the theme song or listen to the theme song without freaking out. I like the characters. I think X-Files is cool. There's some really great science fiction that came out of the show, but I don't claim to be an expert on it at all. You probably know way more about it than I do.
I have to say, some of it is a blur to me, although I've revisited specifically seasons 1 through 9 a few times. I became a big fan because I was able to get into the show fairly early on, so there wasn't a lot of catch-up. My history with the show was that my parents and I think we had basically just gotten Fox. So somewhere in season 2, season 3, Fox was doing a whole retrospective. So we watched that special, got caught up, and then just started watching from that point. And then we were all hooked. This was a show we all stopped what we were doing and watched at 8 or 9 p.m. on a Friday night. Later on, it switched to Sunday nights, but it was like that religious show that we tuned into. It was interesting because, the series breaks down. You have your standalone Monster of the Week episodes, which is just a standalone paranormal case. And then you have the ongoing mythology episodes, which deals with the government covering up the existence of extraterrestrials. Yeah, I just loved both aspects of how the show was structured. And at the heart of it, you have two characters who have a very loving but platonic relationship, and they push that relationship and they get more intimate with each other. Scully being the skeptic, Mulder being the believer. It's a great dynamic.
In high school, when the show was on, so I was hyper aware of it because it was became a cultural phenomenon. I knew there was something about aliens. I knew there was a relationship tension that some fans wanted between Mulder and Scully, and there was that iconic Rolling Stone cover. I remember something about a smoking man, but the funny part is maybe I'd seen the odd snippet of an episode because one of my best friends was super into the show, but I had never sat down and actually watched an entire episode. I have no idea about any of the mythology or the characters or anything, so I do feel like there was a lot of things I was missing. You could kind of tell in shots when it was somebody being revealed, and I assume that if you watch this show, you're like, holy shit, they made the movie. You can watch it as a movie, as a standalone, but I think that if you're into the show, obviously you're going to get a lot more out of it.
So just a bit of context is this movie came out after the cliffhanger season finale of season 5, and season 5 of the show ends where the X-Files are shut down. That's why this movie opens with Mulder and Scully basically on a terrorist assignment. They're not supposed to be on a case that has anything to do with the unexplained. You get that scene in the beginning where they're investigating the building across the street from where the actual bomb threat has been called in. And in one sequence between Mulder and Scully, you get the exposition dump of who they are, their dynamic of how she was basically assigned to debunk Mulder's findings of the unexplained. They just do it in an interesting way where I feel like you're getting the dynamic of the characters. It doesn't just feel like, here's what you didn't know if you haven't seen the show. But at the same time, if you have seen the show, it's very clear that they're trying to catch everybody up to speed and not do it in such a direct way.
Obviously, this film is treading a line between its hardcore viewership and hopefully pulling in new people. So you do have to be like, hey, this is what's been going on. But then everybody who's been watching the show every week, you got to be like, we kind of already know this. It's cool that you said that they did thread that needle in a cool way.
At the other end, you have Twin Peaks Fire Walk With Me, where it's like, what the fuck? If you have never seen Twin Peaks, what the fuck is this?
One tidbit that I found actually very interesting was this was a movie made from a TV show that hadn't ended. Most of these movies, like Star Trek, happened after Next Gen was done. But this movie actually was a giant bridge between season 5 and season 6. So season 6 was a given. At that time when season 5 ended, did people know a season 6 was coming?
Yeah, and the really cool thing that season 5 had tackled, if I'm remembering this correctly, and it ties into how the movie deals with it. Season 5, one of the big shifts was Mulder really starts to question whether he's believing in something legit or it's all a fraud. And the movie, one of the best things for fans, I think, or for me when I think back, was finally getting to see front and center these aliens and getting the whole conspiracy legitimized. You get that great shot at the end where you can see on Mulder's face, he's finally seen proof, and it's like, it rejuvenates his own belief.
Yeah, there's an elation there.
It was just so great to have this movie definitively be like, look at these fucking creatures. Yeah, now I'm just thinking of how this movie begins.
Yeah, and one thing I noticed, first off, I had started watching this 2 months ago, and then today I really sat down and took notes, but I watched it a little bit in the summer, and here in Texas, we had like 5 months of 100-degree heat. So when the film opened in North Texas and there was snow everywhere, that was lovely.
Yeah, I was thinking of you, actually.
Yeah. And then one of the parts when you see like the Neanderthals running, I didn't notice it the first time, but when I watched it the second time, you see the footprint before they go running over it, and it definitely is like a giant three-prongy footprint alien type thing.
Actually, I noticed that, and I don't think I've ever caught that before. There's that great edit when it cuts from the Ice Age to present-day Texas, and it just cuts right to the kid falling through the hole. I just think this movie's very tightly made.
I 100% agree. So I was watching this movie and I'm thinking to myself, did we forget how to make movies? Have we gotten so lazy with technology that we just make everything look the same now?
No, there's a lot to be said about that. When you actually had to make choices of where you're going to set up tracks or a giant camera and then light for that, you know, you're shooting on film. So your choices had to be, I think, a lot more assured and much more definitive.
The terrorist bombing in the beginning, to me, that's just a riveting sequence. It's one of the best explosion scenes ever put on film. The special effects are still better in this movie than so much garbage today.
Talk about just one little aspect of that scene. There's the car lifting up in the back. It's not like a hugely dramatic lift. It's not like the car was like went 90 degrees vertical and spun around and flipped through the air. It just lifted up, and it's just enough of the situation that was dangerous and realistic enough to trigger the sense of tension in the audience.
That car was on a hydraulic system that pushed it up, and you get that great shot where they're spinning and they're both turning their heads as the car is spinning to look in back of them. I just love when Scully's like, there's no time.
Oh, so good.
Mulder, what are you doing?
Something's wrong!
Mulder!
Something's not right.
Mulder, get in the car. There's no time!
Not knowing anything about X-Files, but there's a couple of times it subverted my expectations. So there's the moment when Scully and Mulder are going to have that kiss that I assume some fans want or some fans don't want, but it looks like they're going to have that kiss. And then, of course, that gets subverted. And then in a really silly way, again, there's a lot of story I'm jumping over, but they find this weird thing in the middle of the desert where there's all of a sudden a giant cornfield, and then there's all these bees. They get out there fairly unscathed, and then she leaves this area in Texas because she has a meeting in D.C., and then they're going to have this kiss, and then all of a sudden a bee is behind her shirt collar, and she gets stung with it. So the fact that the bee traveled from Texas unscathed to Washington and then stung her at the moment they were going to kiss, and then I read about it, and it seems the bee is actually something that pissed off a lot of the X-Files fandom.
That sounds like a fandom for you. It's like, the bee.
For me, I don't care. Like, I'll go with it. You only get licensed to do that maybe once or twice, so I even accepted it more when I watched it again recently. I'm like, yeah, it's in the back of her collar. And but it's like...
Speaking from experience, I mean, I found bugs in old jackets.
But how would you not feel it at some point?
But that's the funny part, is we're looking at it and we're talking about it from the logic standpoint, right? But I think a lot of people were just pissed off to be interrupted a moment that they wanted these two characters to have.
What I find more frustrating, I still love it, but to go back at the end, Mulder sees the aliens flying over in the ship and he has this sense of validation. Because Scully is always the skeptic and she's not always on the same page as Mulder, despite everything she's seen or experienced. And the show is going to continue, so they can't fully convert Scully as the believer as well. They still got to keep her in her lane, so to speak. So they pull this shit where, like, obviously Mulder is looking up at the sky. You know, Scully's so out of it at that point that she's not really looking up. She's kind of looking at Mulder. So they still give her the leeway of not fully seeing what Mulder saw in that moment. To me, that was even more frustrating than the bee. It's like, just look up.
The frustrating part for me was in the hole where they trap, I forget his actor's name.
It's a horrific sequence.
Yeah, but you'd think they'd have more security down there.
I love that shot where he's fucked up and he's trying to climb up the ladder and they close this lid and tighten it and then you see all the dirt coming on it.
That scared the crap out of me as a kid. It's like, oh no, they're going to seal him.
Yeah, there's a lot of things. Like when they go to Antarctica, it's really playing on things like claustrophobia and tight spaces and everything. That I enjoyed when he got there. How he got there, that's a whole other story.
In terms of like crazy visual sequences, going to the bees, they find the cornfield in the middle of the desert, and then they go into those awesome looking bubble domes in the middle of the cornfield. Obviously, those doors are just, anybody could just walk the fuck in. When they're in those domes, they hear buzzing, but they don't know it's buzzing. And then the bees get released, and you just see the silhouettes of them in a big wide shot, and they're just running. That's just a signature, iconic sequence right there.
That was on one of the posters, even.
Scully,
Yeah?
run!
And then even, I love when the smoking man shows up. He steps out of the helicopter as he lights his cigarette and you see the propellers out of focus in the background.
One thing I will say about the walking into the cool little inflatable hive thing, it almost seems like they let anyone walk in, but it just goes back to what Martin Landau's character was saying. These guys don't make mistakes, so maybe it was a setup. According to that meeting, they were saying, oh yeah, we have to separate them, hurt Scully in some way. And so I think if they found the bees, letting them into the bee place to get stung would be a way of doing that. It's all a little contrived. If they're so powerful and secretive, they could probably have done a better job of hurting Scully, like directly. But all the issues with this movie that are like, oh, why wasn't it like this? Or why didn't this happen instead of this happening? It's all like, okay, yeah, you have those. But if you increase your suspension of disbelief, everything is visually interesting. Like it's all moving quickly enough. I was never bored.
Probably because these guys are all coming out of a 46 or whatever it is runtime for weekly television, right? So they were now given probably a great luxury of having a 2-hour runtime, but they were still very much schooled in writing for television where you can't waste moments, I don't think. So that would carry over to this effort in this feature film where they're like, we got this great platform. We're going to be in movie theaters. It's a great way to expand our audience. Let's make the best movie we can. That's what I also recognize, that this is a nice, lean, tight movie.
Going back to our conversation on Ninja Turtles, where we talked about the movie, what the movie meant in the 90s, what the subtitle of the movie brought to a property. It was more noticeable when you went from the show to the movie, that the quality had increased, the budget had increased. For me, it was harder with the X-Files. As a show, it was so cinematic. Now, every show is shot like a movie. But back in the 90s, that wasn't always the case.
Yeah, when you're going from into the movie, there's going to be slight changes that reflect the budget upgrade, or, you know, when Power Rangers went from the show to the movie, the suits look a lot better in the movie.
Yeah, so that's a good question. Did that actually translate from TV? Did you know that you were stepping into a bigger cinematic realm from just episodic television to now, like as Carl's saying, the movie?
The show, to me, is one of the first television shows to capture a cinematic vibe. With the transition into the movie, yeah, they were upping their game, and it felt like the X-Files now as a big budget Hollywood blockbuster, and I love that. I think for the most part, this movie did capture the fan base. I don't think it was as big a hit as they had hoped. I don't know if it really pushed the needle in terms of indoctrinating anybody who wasn't already a fan of the X-Files, but this movie did make a chunk of money. Probably not as much as they hoped for, because I know they, like Star Trek, they really wanted to churn these movies out. We didn't get a second movie till 2008.
Yeah, I had read that Chris Carter, he actually was annoyed that Fox wanted a season 6 because he wanted to use this movie as a springboard to continue to make movies. And Fox is like, no, we're making way too much money. You're doing the movie, but coming back to do season 6.
This is another thing this movie really confirmed was the fact that there is this conspiracy between the government working with the aliens to help them colonize. But what they don't realize is that the aliens really want to basically inhabit our bodies and like burst out of them. So it's almost like repopulation versus colonization. But then the government is secretly trying to develop this vaccine.
You look at like these conspiracies, and like the conspiracy on the surface can seem pretty far-fetched of all of this government or all world governments working with aliens and what is their end game and all this, that, and the other. But then you look at like QAnon and all the shit that they believe and all that. So I thought it was interesting to watch this film also with the lens of what's been happening around us as a society in the past several years with viruses and conspiracies and all this kind of stuff.
It's aged quite well. Like, take it as just what it is and without like disconnected from the X-Files show. It's a great conspiracy film. It has everything in it. I think it has like FEMA's going to take over. Oh, there's a society of people that are working with aliens.
Yeah, and the race for a vaccine. So yeah, it feels very tuned into our moment.
A plague?
A plague to end all plagues, Agent Mulder. A silent weapon for a quiet war. The systematic release of an indiscriminate organism for which the men who will bring it on still have no cure. They've been working on this for 50 years. While the rest of the world have been fighting crooks and commies, these men have been secretly negotiating a planned Armageddon.
Negotiating with whom?
I think you know.
There's a couple of science fiction odes in one disc that I think is great. Like the film ends in Tunisia where they shot the Tatooine sequences for the Star Wars movies. And then I love how that whole alien experimental colony is happening in Antarctica, which made me think of H.P. Lovecraft and At the Mountains of Madness where the ancient ones were. There's the great disc where David Duchovny, his character is all drunk at the bar. The bathrooms are occupied, so he does what any intelligent FBI agent does when you need to take a piss. You go out into the alleyway, and then there's an Independence Day poster he's pissing literally under. So the two odes in the disc of sci-fi made me laugh.
I'm glad you brought that up. That sequence before he goes outside to take a piss, I just love that whole drunken monologue he has. But like I said earlier, that drunken monologue is also another moment where they get to tell you exposition about his entire character summary. But it's a guy who's drunk and, rambling, so they can get away with it.
I'm the bartender in that sequence where she's hearing it for the first time. You guys are like, oh yeah, this is this guy and what he believes in his life story. And she's like, okay, that's enough, you're cut off.
Spooky Mulder, whose sister was abducted by aliens when he was just a kid and who now chases after little green men with a badge and a gun, shouting to the heavens or anyone who will listen that the fix is in and that the sky is falling. And when it hits, it's going to be the shitstorm of all time.
There's a sequence that I love. This is completely shifting gears, but Mulder and Scully are literally at a crossroads in a car together. And then he's like, oh, we should go left. And she's like, no, I think we should go right. Which I think is like pretty spot on, not knowing anything really about these characters, but like their dynamics as characters together. And then he's like, just starts driving the car straight. And then he's like, have I ever been wrong? And he's like, at least not in driving.
Also, one of the elements from the show that carried over to the movie, but again, just got elevated cinematically. Mark Snow, who composed all the music for the shows and the movies, his music is great throughout that series. I mean, the theme alone is iconic and haunting.
Oh yeah, even I can recognize that.
He even ups his game as a composer. I love how the theme is tied into these more cinematic, orchestra-driven music pieces, but they still weave the score in there. Everything just seems heightened.
It's definitely the movie. Yeah, you're going to make the theme song into a bunch of different versions of the theme song to fit different moods.
when I watched the movie and I heard that iconic tune from Mark Snow that opens X-Files. It is one of those sounds that gives you goosebumps. So that kind of drew me in immediately. And then I just learned that music was created by a synth product sample called Whistling Joe, and also includes whistling from Mark Snow's wife Glenn. Oh, it's funny. I want to mention this now. I'm thinking about it. We're talking about this, and as Jared said earlier, he was pushing, let's watch this one, right? I had to really clarify, like, what the fuck movie am I watching? Because it is only X-Files. It doesn't even say Fight the Future on IMDb. It's just X-Files, and as Carl has alluded to, it doesn't even say the movie. It's just X-Files. And I'm like, I knew a series came back. I knew there was a movie. I didn't realize there was a second movie. I had no fucking idea what the thing it was I was going to watch.
It's funny because the tagline is Fight the Future, and over the years, depending on how you're looking at the cover to this movie, which format, it's almost unofficially been adopted as like a subtitle to the movie, but it really was just the tagline.
Near the end of the movie, the one guy's like talking about Mulder and that, and said he's determined and now reinvested. So again, that must be hyped for the fans going into season 6. But he says he's determined and now reinvested. One man can't fight the future. Because that's one thing I'm thinking about the whole time. When you're one person going up against a giant conspiracy, like how the fuck do you do that?
Yeah, and that was it. Like I said, season 5 was full of Mulder doubting himself and what he believed. His whole spirit and his quest has just been reignited. It might be hard for some people to not look at this as an X-Files movie, but like I was saying earlier, is that if you just like the genre of thrillers, conspiracy thrillers, sci-fi movies, I just think this movie excels in those very basic genres. And this movie is probably even more hyper-relevant today.
No matter what anyone thought of this movie in 1998, watching it again today, it's like an artifact from another time as far as filmmaking goes. It's like back when we knew what we were doing and everything was a lot harder to do, but it required people with a ton of skill and knowledge, so everything felt a little more grounded. Just going back to my first time watching this movie as a kid, not understanding really any of it and being kind of bored and disappointed that it wasn't more like Men in Black. Now, as an adult, watching it, I'm like, oh yeah, this is great. I have no issues with this. So I think as a conspiracy theory film, this is really fun. And as an X-Files film, this is good.
I actually approached this movie with great trepidation because I didn't really know what I would bring to the conversation. As somebody who was aware of the cultural significance of this show in the 90s and had not ever watched episodes. So this movie holds up probably even more so than maybe the creators had initially thought when they were writing this in the late 90s and the film came out in 98. So I really appreciated that.
That's wonderful.
I'll leave with the great Martin Landau. Piece of advice I think he has for all of us through this film. Do not stand around holding your yank while bombs are exploding.
And joining myself... Oh, wait. I fucked that up. I forgot to intro myself. How do we do this again?
Just do the Troy McClure thing.
Yeah, that was a good intro to the film, so...
Yeah.
That's a movie that I want to see. I want to see the 96-hour journey from Washington to Antarctica that Mulder makes.
Hey, Rob, there's no movie. It's going to be a limited series.
All right, yeah. Now we go. The three of us can bring it back with Chris Carter's blessing. It'll be a limited Disney event.
It's going to be a whole season, a whole show. It's called Journey. It's
That's what Mandalorian is. It's him walking everywhere that first season. So we can do that with Scully trying to... that's why I need you guys. I need Mulder to get from Washington, D.C. to Antarctica in 95-ish hours.
That bee was a buzzkill.
Yeah. So it was literally a buzzkill, Carl. And logically, it shouldn't have been there. And then emotionally, for people watching this show, they're like, fuck this fucking bee.
Ah, this movie's ruined.
Yeah.